they began conceiving of a cosmology that was, right, it has apparent order. And to them, and I believe this is true, order is evidence of consciousness. Up there, this is the idea of the gods and the angels being above the clouds. Not necessarily material aliens. They wouldn't have had any idea what that was.
What is the esoteric understanding of God?
I was able to really start having experiences and then understanding, wait, there is much more. Like I wasn't even aware of what I wasn't aware of.
Right, yeah.
And which traditions are still alive today that are going to take you to that place, because not all of them will. The people are going to automatically probably think I'm some sort of government asset coming to give disinfo. I've been accused of that many times. The magical agent, by which, to grasp the fulcrum of this is to be able to make all things happen, to act as the magus, and so on and so forth. There is a very little treatise called The Science of Hermes, and I found it in a bookstore in Brooklyn probably like 15 years ago.
Wow.
And he says, Azot, the magical agent, is nothing less than...
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends, and this one is about so much more than the phenomenon, at least in the way that it is typically depicted, because this mind meld is about the hidden layers of reality that we are taught to believe don't even exist. And it's about the hidden intelligences that operate within said hidden layers. And in older esoteric traditions, this kind of knowledge was not just theoretical. It was earned through education and initiation until it was experienced directly. So in this way of seeing and experiencing, consciousness being fundamental, for instance, consciousness would not be fundamental because it is such a elusive, irreducible aspect of reality. It would be fundamental because it's a lived experience, because it's self-evident. And once you arrive there, the phenomenon starts to look very different. And this is what I was alluding to in the beginning when I said that this conversation was about more than the phenomenon, at least in the way that it's usually depicted, or whatever I said. And is that still ambiguous? Yes. Am I going to elucidate that more right now? No. Because one, I don't want to ramble on, and two, we've got Ike Baker in the Mind Meld, and he would do a better job of it than I would anyway. Ike is a writer, a longtime practitioner and student of the Western esoteric path. He's the author of Etheric Magic and of Formless Fire. And his work does exactly what I was just talking about. It approaches all of this beyond the theory. Does it get into theory? Of course. But it's about orienting your mind toward a path of lived experience, toward real felt initiation into the invisible mysteries that are all around us. It's a path that led Ike himself to direct contact with higher intelligence and a view of reality that is layered, conscious, and far more beautiful and alive than we're taught. And I believe that is sufficient orientation, my friends. But first, please like, subscribe, comment, share. I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. And speaking of both appreciation and initiation, if you want to initiate yourself further, become a member on our YouTube members page, or sign up over at patreon.com/third eye drops. I am now posting weekly patron/member only content, including a 2-hour plus transmission with my man Adam Curry on divination and psi. I'm very stoked about the library we are building over in those sections. I suppose I should also mention additional rewards if you sign up over at Patreon. So much love to those already supporting. And with that, let's get into this mind meld. Ike Baker, you are a microcosm of something that really, really interests me and fascinates me, because I obviously have been infatuated with the esoteric, with the phenomena. But particularly speaking of the former, you're somebody who's really living this esoteric path in a deep way, in a sort of, I was going to say untrailblazed way. But it's only untrailblazed if you're like looking at sort of like the readily available examples around you, because there are people that do this and have done this throughout the ages, but it's not something that's easy to do. It often requires tons of research, tons of dedication and experimentation, and it seems like you're really doing that, man.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, man. It is certainly something that is a labor of love, and it is something that I try to allow myself to be guided in. So if there is any new ground, or at least the appearance of new ground being broken, it's more so that I truly believe that I'm trying to be led in that direction rather than you know cut my way through it. And as you mentioned, there are, I wouldn't say an overwhelming amount of people, but there are certainly other people I know that are doing this. It's just how forthcoming are they willing to be in
Yeah.
delivering this material to the public? There's a long tradition in esoteric orders of hoarding information.
Yeah. That makes sense. And we could probably get more into that later in the podcast, but I just sort of, I guess, in a knee-jerk way, brought up the two topics that I feel like this channel is starting to congregate around, which is like
Mhm.
the phenomena, the esoteric. But it goes so much deeper than that, you know, this conversation that we're about to have, because it gets to the very nature of reality and consciousness and our assumptions about reality and consciousness,
Mhm.
right? Like everybody watching this channel, for the most part, other than if there's like some super skeptical nerd that like gets off on content that they hate or something. Um, Everybody watching this is already going to have this idea in their head that um, they probably believe consciousness is either fundamental or has like some kind of actual ontos to it, aside from just being an epiphenomena of the brain. They're probably open to the idea of other entities. They're probably open to the idea that we just live in this like very lower dimensional slice of reality. But even if you are open to those ideas and you've adopted those ideas, you still are living in a fundamentally sort of physicalist, reductionist kind of view of reality. And because you are, it makes those new worldviews difficult to adopt in a rigorous, responsible, real way, because people are also very susceptible to bullshit. I mean, there's
Oh
like
yeah.
that's the other problem, is like as soon as you open your mind and start going down these rabbit holes, the very low hanging fruit stuff is absolute garbage a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, not to get into a sense making conversation right away, because that's not the most fun thing. But why don't we get into a conversation about why those views are worth having and that they do represent reality in a better way?
Yeah. Well, it's many good points. You know, we're in an age of unveiling. I want to get into that a little bit, but because it's not, I don't necessarily agree with the modern zeitgeist, this idea that, this is, it has the potential to be an awakening, but the way it's going, I'm not so sure anymore. Time will tell. And this is because there's this thing that interferes with our ability to understand. And a lot of the times, I've sort of talked about it as the Santa Claus syndrome. So we're waking up from this idea that things are, reality is the way that we have described it since the early 1900s, 1950s, so on and so forth, and that this is what life is all about. Um, the issue is that we are, as a species, I would say we're still kind of in the adolescence of our spiritual maturity. That's a big claim for somebody like me to make, but just to contextualize where I get this viewpoint from. So we kind of enter into this. Well, if all that stuff is a lie, there's a little bit of a resentment. There's an existential shock, and so what do? We run to the exact antithesis of that, rather than, well, hold on. Somebody told me the rules wrong, so why don't I learn them? And the
Yeah.
way that you do that is that you become, um, you need to become objective for a little bit and keep it at a very far distance and observe. observe what's going on before you make conclusions. Whereas we have a large group of people, and this is exacerbated by the speed and wealth and really oversaturation of content nowadays across the board. We have a group of people that is waking up and it's basically like, oh, like your parents lied to you about Santa Claus, and now there's this trauma. Yeah. There's this trauma. You have Santa Claus syndrome. It was all a lie, man. So you run to the exact opposite. And what is that? That's the delivery mechanism for the Hegelian dialectic. We have another form of social programming waiting for you. Once we deconstruct this one to your shock and existential awe. So this is essentially, I think, what I see playing out psychologically. And there's one further maybe challenge for modern people. And it has to do exactly what you said, this quote unquote, so to speak, factory installed software that the hardware is running. It's like a pair of glasses or a pair of contacts that you don't know you're wearing.
Totally.
And this is reductionist Cartesian materialism. Or it's called positivism, which again, there's some neuro-linguistic programming in that, right? Some manipulation around the word positivism.
It's positive. It's great.
It's positive, yeah. Positivism is a viewpoint for anybody that's not familiar that science can answer every question. When in reality, what we're doing is we've created a scientific methodology, but all we've really done is constructed a little sandbox. And so that makes people feel very comfortable. We're sitting in the sandbox and I see my boundaries, and that makes whatever I'm doing in the sandbox less overwhelming. I know what's going on, but any noise, any rustling from the dark periphery of the forest which surrounds this box, we look up for a second and we say, it's not in a box.
Right.
So, and that is not just inculcated through educational institutions. I mean, very much so it is, but in society, in the intellectual culture and the mental diet, we are, very often not consciously consuming, but consuming nonetheless. And so then it becomes this kind of, does the fish know what water is sort of thing. And that's the intellectual, the mental environment we're swimming in. And as a consequence, now that all these esoteric or esoteric worldviews are coming back into our awareness, we're trying to understand the esoteric with our exoteric mind.
Right.
And ne'er the twain shall meet. You must learn to see these things, to understand these worldviews and these perspectives on their terms. It's just a different kind of way of understanding reality. It's not, one is not more or less valid than the other. But I would say, one shuts out while the other includes. And obviously we know that the scientific reductionism, the materialist worldview is it's predicated on blocking things out, putting a set of intellectual dogmatic blinders on you. So you're just dismissing these things rather than even entertaining the idea that it could happen. These are called a priori assumptions. It's like, oh, that didn't happen. Why not? Because it can't.
Right, exactly.
That's a logical fallacy.
Yeah, man. So for you, when did you start realizing that this horizon to reality is much further than what that worldview allows for? The idea that that consciousness is real, that other entities, other things that you definitely can't explain through materialist reductionist means are real, that we should be going down these esoteric paths to try to make sense of those things. Let's just start with that. I think that's probably enough.
Yes. Well, in retrospect, it appears to me now that I probably, like many, many other people, have always had I don't want to say intuition, because that's not the right word, but I've had an awareness. Perhaps it was like, a background program that was running, but I had an awareness that there was something more. It was a deep internal knowing. um, that didn't necessarily anticipate anything or predict anything, but it was a state of consciousness, a part of consciousness that is somewhere above discursive reasoning. And it's in this space where I just sort of had a memory of that was, maybe covered in dust and cobwebs and stuck all the way in the back of the closet, but that memory was there. And so I was always sort of interested in following these threads. I was always drawn towards the mysterious. Also, I see a lot of psychological problems with the modern worldview. Um, and I think that those psychological problems, right, because we've as a society, for the most part, have accepted a lot of those modern worldviews and those rules. It's that manipulative psychology, that fear-based, scarcity-based, competitive mindset is now manifesting itself in the real world, in the society that we live in, and in what we are producing in reality, as a a group of civilization as a whole. But I did try my hardest to follow these threads, but there was not much available to me.
Right.
There were, as a kid from growing up in the late, really the mid to late 90s to early 2000s, I only had what I call Dan Brown occultism,
right.
And that's not to disparage it. It just means that, like, yeah, I had this kind of vague, fantasy informed, because a lot of that stuff came out of, as it always does, comes out of the author's imagination when we're writing fiction. And these are the things that were available to me. And the History Channel gets interested in it and all this stuff. So I had this awareness of Freemasonry, of Kabbalah, but I didn't really understand it at any depth. And I remember I was about 19 years old, and my aunt had a tenant. She's a very nice lady, very quiet, but she threw herself in front of a car or train. Sorry. And my aunt went down into the apartment, which was in her basement, and she saw that this lady was a hoarder, and she had tons of books just piled up and in creating aisles and things. So she asked me to come and help her box them up and take them out, because books are deceptively heavy.
Yes, they are. I just moved.
Around.
I can attest to that. I got rid of like a whole bunch of books, and yeah.
I remember I was like, "Hey, man, I want to send you my book." You're like, "Send me a PDF."
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, but so I go and I help her, and we're moving all this stuff out. And there's this one book, and its cover design just catches my eye. It's called "The Oracle of Kabbalah" by Richard Seidman. And I say, it's a little weird, but would you mind if I take this? And she said, sure. So the next day I walked around my neighborhood reading it, and I finished it. Small book. I didn't necessarily feel like I was more educated on the Kabbalah than I had been before I read it, but something had struck a bell, and I knew that it was important. So I went on the internet yellow or white pages when people used to use those, and I searched Long Island Kabbalah study group. That's where I grew up. Guy's information came up. I reached out to him. He said that group doesn't meet anymore, but there's this other thing. And that other thing ended up being, the initiatory and ceremonial society called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And I stumbled into that, and it's a long story from there, but eventually it was through those experiments, it was through those initiations, and it was through a particular place that I was at in my life where everything had failed me and fallen apart, that I was able to really start having experiences and then understanding, wait, there is much more. Like I wasn't even aware of what I wasn't aware of.
You're right.
And so that's the case for a lot of people. And I don't claim to have all the secrets of the universe, but certainly I understand the ancient worldview. And It's only because I was able to recognize
Yeah.
and dismantle, utterly dismantle the perceptual software, which is programming.
Yeah, that's a great anecdote, and that's you leave us in a tantalizing little conversational frontier there, because there's so many ways to go with what you just laid out. But one of the things that popped into my mind, probably because I'm also an esoteric nerd, is that it doesn't matter really even what esoteric discipline you're looking into. One of the things you're eventually going to come across are these maps of reality, right? And as you know, as a lot of the audience will probably know, what you see a lot of the time is this hierarchical sort of picture where there are literally these layered um, layers or spheres, right? Often corresponding to planets.
Mhm.
And within these spheres, there are other intelligences, other beings, other essentially they're presented as these like archetypal sheaths over the top of where we live, and usually this is laid out as earth. So it
Mhm.
appears to be a picture of the physical cosmos, which we now know is like not a correct picture. But there's always been something in me that knows that there's something more to what they're trying to communicate in those images. And you, as somebody who is steeped in Western esotericism, is a practicing Western esotericist, I feel like you have a deeper insight into what that is, and that in a lot of ways like kind of exemplifies this horizon that I'm imagining, is that there's this world that, while it's not a literal representation of physical reality that's out there, it is a representation of something real, of some other realms where some other intelligences or beings exist. And for, one of my ideas, just to be, transparent with the audience, is to find this Venn diagram between the phenomena and the esoteric. And I don't want to rush that conversation, because I feel like it really requires foreplay. And I don't just want to like slam it in there for the buzzwords, for the topics. Um Again, let's just start there, because I have a bad habit of rambling too much and leaving too much on the table, and then we never get to all the things that I rambled about. So I'm just gonna leave it at that, with a big smorgasbord of esoteric mouth noises, and you can you can do what you want with them.
Well, and that's because you're passionate about this stuff. I would not be sitting here if I thought I'd be conversing with a dispassionate person. So that's what makes you a good host. What makes your channel a success, if you ask me. Which you
Thanks,
didn't,
man.
but there's my 2 cents. I so we're about to. You're forcing me, right, to get into our favorite subject, which is really not. There wasn't much of a push at all, but we have to talk about Platonism.
Yes.
We have to talk about Platonism and recontextualize that. For anybody that's not aware, the Platonic dialogues are the source; they are the bed of the Western esoteric traditions. Yes, absolutely. Much of that was informed by ancient Egyptian religious culture and ancient Egyptian intellectual culture. However, we don't really have a systematized record of the beliefs of the philosophical Mediterranean of antiquity as rock solid, consistent, and whole as the Platonic dialogues. It's a minor miracle that all of them come to us.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how the tradition got to us today, is from Plato. So we have to go back and see. Okay, then what were they thinking? Right, that's where the sheaths you're talking about,
Yeah.
the sort of nested cosmological diagram, is directly out of Plato. Right, in Book 10 of the Republic, in what's called the Myth of
Yeah.
it's later posited as a philosophical scientific uh, theory or proposition by somebody who studied with Plato contemporaneously. So this we believe this dialogue to have been written around the same time that Eudoxus gives us this model of the universe. Um, it becomes what's known as the Ptolemaic model.
Hmm.
Now, let's go back to maybe a prehistoric version of humanity. because this is what they're telling us they believe. But let's see how they might have discerned these beliefs. A person would have several considerations, right? The most basic stuff is survival. The most basic stuff is having your needs met and staying alive, staying warm, staying not eaten, knowing when to hunt, not drowning. So what determines these things? Well, they would know whether or not there's light and I can see, so I should be awake, and there is no light because it's dark, so I should be in hibernation mode. That's based off of what the sun appears to be doing. On the other hand, there are reproductive necessities of humankind that sync to what the moon is doing a lot of times when left to its natural course. Not only that, but it controls the flood of tides, the ebb and flow of tides. It has to do with what the moon is doing, and it's changing in these regular patterns, right? That's where we get the 30, 31 days of the month. Originally, it was 29 days, and it was the lunar cycle from dark to full, back to dark again, or new. And then finally, or not finally, but I guess for the sake of completing my point here, is that do I have more daylight or do I have less? Does it get darker earlier, or can I be out hunting, doing whatever later? Is it really warm where I have to take layers off? Is it really cold where I need to find shelter and heat? What the sun is doing, right? That governs.
Yeah,
they noticed. Okay, it moves north or south depending on in its trajectory across the sky, depending on what the season is. So they looked at these cycles and they said, these cycles continually happen. They're regular. They might not make sense to us, but they are cycles, right? The sun disappears, then rises in the east. Always. The sun has never risen in the west and set in the east. Okay. So the moon has never gone from full to dark immediately. It's cyclical. And so what they would have seen is that there is an order that does not change. It does not change, right? And we can calculate hundreds of years into the future where the planets are going to be, because that the astronomical science is that exact.
Yeah.
But everything down here, below the moon, so to speak, changes and is changeable. So they would have oriented their idea of where are the changes coming from? Up there. This is the idea of the gods and the angels being above the clouds. Not necessarily material aliens. They wouldn't have had any idea what that was. They didn't have any concept of interstellar travel. They would not have been able to conceive of that, even if they did experience it. They wouldn't understand. But for the sake of the philosophical context, they believed, okay, that's the ordering is in the celestial sphere, and in the earth, the realm of the elements, which are constantly mixing. Water is exposed to heat. It turns to vapor, air, fire creates earth, etc., so on and so forth. All these things are in constant change, and it appears that it's because of what's going on in the skies. For instance, the Egyptian, there's a lot of talk about when the new year should be, right? Big hullabaloo. Well, the Egyptians celebrated their new year on or around July 19th. And it didn't necessarily have to do with the solar new year or anything like that. It was when Sirius rose in the east before the sun, they would know that the Nile was going to overflow. Oh, wow. And that was their new year. And so their new year season. And so that's really important, right? Because if the flooding of the Nile is essential for the survival of your civilization, it's because you need to move where the river flooded. You need to move within the floodplain to plant your crops. So that means if you're not paying attention to when it's going to flood, you're going to lose everything, and you may die because you can't get out of there fast enough with all your livestock. So these considerations were of the utmost importance to early people that didn't have clocks, like we do, mechanical clocks. Then we have digital clocks. So that was the ordering principle. It happened up there. And so they began conceiving of a cosmology that was, right, it has apparent order. And to them, and I believe this is true, order is evidence of consciousness.
Yes.
Why is it evidence of consciousness? Well, because it shows synchronousness and synchrony, and that requires the realization of something, the acknowledgement of something. So I meet you, Michael, and Mike's a great guy, and so I come over and we go to lunch. All right. Or you meet me and you're like, wow, that dude's intense. I'm not really sure. I never want to see him again. And we never meet again.
Not true.
A lot of people, I'm just saying, just for the sake of a funny analogy, a lot of people would see that as, yeah, that makes sense. There's consciousness involved. But that there's a recognition that happens on what we would consider an unconscious or non-conscious level from our modern materialist worldview. And that is the attraction and repulsion of atoms and molecules and things of this molecular bonding and things like this. How does a molecule know that it needs to bond? How does it know I don't like this thing? You say, well, it doesn't know. It's just it's a dead force. If it was dead, it would have no action. It would have no recognition. There would be no response.
Yeah.
So they see order in this, and they see capital I intellect. Yeah. They see the mind of God in it all. And then they begin, well, if this is an intellect, if this is a mind, if this is an ordered creation, there are many steps in between this, but I'm oversimplifying. Right. Let's interact with it. Because we have consciousness too. So, and that exploration begins the religious life of our world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, now that we're on this topic of, there's the theists are celebrating, the atheists are like angry, like just theoretically to just straw man everybody watching this, which of course is so everybody occupies a much more nuanced point than that. But that does bring up an interesting point. What is the difference between a Platonic and don't want to broad brush it with the word esoteric because that can mean a lot of different things, but I'm going to do it anyway because I don't have to be as responsible as you. What is the difference between the esoteric Platonic view of God versus the straw man, knee jerk man in the sky sort of version of God? And to put more nuance on this question, you bring up a great point, and it's a point that I struggle with walking the tightrope of all the time in terms of how I would describe myself and where my beliefs lean. Like, for instance, to go back to those examples you were giving from nature, right? It seems like nature dances on this pinhead between order and disorder of being so finely tuned and miraculous that it cannot be random. Yet it is extremely messy and tragic. I have a cat with cancer right now. It's like you just see these things happening where it's like, if there is an all-powerful God, how, the cliche questions about suffering, about the problem of evil, all of those things are so fucking real, especially when you're seeing them right in front of your face. So what, not to ask you, why isn't everything perfect? Why don't we live in this perfect divine construct if there's a real God,
Well, I think you know the answer to that because you've read the Timaeus.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But I don't think the vast majority of the audience has. Yeah. But to sort of like serve it up, what is the esoteric understanding of God?
Okay, so I'm going to address a few things. This might, in my usual fashion, be a little roundabout. Please. Long story short, let's say the Platonic version of God is ultimately it comes out of the Pythagorean.
Yeah,
it's basically informed by. There are three main three really large, I would say the biggest contributors or influencers to the Platonic tradition, which is the foundation of the Western esoteric worldview for millennia, for 2,500 years almost now. Okay, these are Parmenides of Elea, Pherecydes, and Pythagoras. Okay, and these
I don't know Pherecydes. You got a new one for me.
Oh yeah, there you go. I'm writing about him in a book, so I'll have that out for everybody in a year or so. But Pherecydes was an ancient mythographer and a cosmologist, and it was older than Pythagoras. So the timeline goes Pherecydes, Pythagoras, Parmenides. These three guys, but they're all pre-Socratics.
Yeah.
Now the pre-Socratic Hellenic philosophers were much more natural philosophers. They were not necessarily interested in discovering metaphysical truths that transcended the order of the cosmos. They were interested in, like, for instance, Empedocles, right? He was very interested in the elements. What is everything made of? And this, witchy earth, fire, water, air, and earth kind of 4-element alchemical natural magic thing that comes directly from Empedocles of Akragas. He was the one to systematize that and put it down on the record. There are 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, from which everything is made, and they are motivated by 2 forces, he says: love and strife. What do we say? Attraction and aversion.
Yeah.
So and that is the way that they.
But not to interrupt you, but one important caveat to that point, that they were interested in not as many metaphysical things, is they are, well, there's 2 things. One, they're always painted as these sort of like philosopher saints capable of all of these metaphysical things, like Pythagoras, particularly, but also Parmenides. And Parmenides' one surviving work on nature is literally him doing like soul flight to go on this journey to somehow encounter the goddess of night. And the goddess of night gives him all of these revelations about reality. So even if they were interested in these basic questions, the way they were accessing this knowledge is incredibly fascinating, and something I would love to hear you riff on as someone who presumably is also doing very similar things in their own practices.
Certainly. Well, and that's kind of the point I was getting to, is that these 3 men, Pherecydes, Pythagoras, and Parmenides, were interested in metaphysics. They were interested in the higher stuff: being, non-being, what is, the highest conception. Where does the buck stop with this intelligent order? So they came out of the pre-Socratic school, and they were the guys who were right. Parmenides is normally referred to as the father of metaphysics. So they were the few pre-Socratics who were genuinely, their main problems centered around being, non-being, God, the gods, etc. And so they all influenced Plato. So what you got to understand about the Platonic dialogues then is that the Platonic dialogues are by and large informed by a metaphysic. They are concerned with explaining metaphysics. It's why they take us on the scenic route to nowhere if we are just trying to examine them as logical documents that explain phenomena. Plato goes to great lengths to take you through this intellectual journey to say, oh, we don't know. We can't know. Not here. And he's always pointing to something transcendent, which ultimately he inherits from the Pythagorean tradition, which are the forms. Okay, and he says the ultimate form is the form of the good, ton agathon. He also, it's also related to beauty. Okay, that's the ultimate form, which everything strives, because everything is constantly striving towards its relative highest good. And in that way, we're always trying, even though we might be a little confused, but everyone, even people that are doing bad stuff, according to the Platonic dialogues, they think that they're striving towards their highest good. And so this is the idea of that. What this comes from, these Platonic forms, are equivalent to the Pythagorean numbers. Okay?
Yeah.
And the numbers are the root essences. Now, I'm not, to distinguish, for anybody listening, I'm not talking about the symbols we use to indicate numbers. I'm talking about number itself, which is a universal. It's a universal mathematical certainty. As a matter of fact, if I asked you to go out and get 5, you'd ask me 5 of what? And rightly so. Because there's nowhere in this world that you can go and find 5 at its core, but you can find 5 of everything. So it's simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. And so this was what the Pythagoreans were conceiving of. What are these things? What are these things that we call number? And so they viewed them as these essential highest causes that then their relationships created everything from the astronomical cycles to music and harmony, right? To geometry, things that are constructed in the physical universe and its laws down here. So there is this idea that the good in the Platonic system is the highest form, and the one in the Pythagorean system is the highest form. That is, but there's other numbers and there's other forms. This is what we call monism, okay? Yeah. Where they do believe that ultimately the ultimate God, the creator God, is one, but that there are other gods, other essences that follow it, that form it, that express it. Because ultimately that one, you can't really know it. It's an impersonal God, capital G, so to speak. And so all these other numbers and permutations were expressions of it. And we get in what happens in, I would say, more like you're talking about Sky Daddy stuff. Well, in order to interact with these things and talk about them in a way that is a little bit more sophisticated, but less abstract than just talking about number and harmony and ratio, we anthropomorphize them.
Right.
And we talk about them, right? Pherecydes, who was the teacher of Pythagoras, who then Parmenides was at one point a Pythagorean, and then he left the school. So it's this lineage, it's a trajectory of thought. But we ultimately get we ultimately get these representations of the gods so that we can talk about them, right? Pherecydes was a mythographer. And this is very evident. This is why the Orphic tradition is so consistently woven into the Pythagorean, where there have been some scholars that have gone so far to say that the Orphic cult was a Pythagorean hoax, they created it. So there's this, it's all about mythography. But if you don't have the keys, if you don't have the philosophical keys to understand it, you're going to start worshiping Sky Daddies, and then we're in trouble.
Or even worse, not to sidestep back into like sloppy meaning making, but you're going to make your own myths and you're going to make them sloppy, or you're going to look at other stories that are circulating in the zeitgeist and you're going to like you're going to project everything Jung style into those and say, it must be this. It must be aliens. It must be that version of God. It must be this. And then whenever you reach dissonance and you encounter things that don't fit into that, you either push it down, you make excuses for why it doesn't exist, and that leads you away from the truth and basically ensconces you further into this like fantasy version of reality, right? And I think everybody watching, sorry everybody, but we're all doing that to some degree, right? Because reality is so fucking hard to square for all those reasons I mentioned earlier, all of the suffering we encounter, all of the unfair things, all of the things we wish we didn't have to deal with. So we whenever possible, some part of us clings to that fantasy, and then another part of us pushes what's inconvenient for that fantasy away. But in our heart of hearts, we all really want the truth. We all really do, as you point to, want to approach this highest form of the good, or whatever our highest possibility is. And that, to me, is why I'm interested in the esoteric path, because it actually seems like it's challenging you to do that. It's providing this like circuitous, complicated path of puzzles and experiences and initiations that one can actually undertake or attempt to undertake to try to like reach these revelations that you may not even be able to language. It may be challenging to even language whatever, anamnesis or revelations that you actually encounter. But God damn it, is it worth doing? And I say that as someone who's not as part of like the initiatory path in the way that you are, but all of my most impactful experiences that have, I wouldn't say reoriented my ontology, but they've shown me that yes, there's something real here. It's not, about the out of body story, for instance, like,
right.
It's a very different thing to be intellectually open to the idea that, that seems like a thing. A lot of very smart people both contemporarily and from history, have had an experience that sounds like an out-of-body experience, sounds real. Then you have it yourself, and it is so visceral and so real and so not metaphorical. And then that makes you be like, okay, that is a thing that exists beyond my imagination. And that is what this path can offer. And I say this path in an extremely wide bracketed, you know, whitewashed, irresponsible way. But again, I don't have to be as responsible as you.
Well, and that the key there's a couple of things that I want to say. I want to mention something about the highest good, right? But also the key there then becomes figuring out, which traditions are still alive today that are going to take you to that place, because not all of them will. Not all of them are designed to do that. Not all of them are designed to give you initiation. The system that we receive, this is going to rub a lot of the people are going to automatically probably think I'm some sort of government asset coming to give disinfo. I've been accused of that many times, but the initiatory tradition was continued into the modern day by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn when it was founded in 1888 in London. Now, it had all sorts of participants and phases before that of evolution and contribution, but all of these people, every one of them was a Mason. So a lot of people will think, I know a lot of people that are interested in UAP disclosure or whatever it is, metaphysics, spirituality in the modern day. They think Freemasons are evil and they're this cabal and things like this. They kept this stuff intact for us and moved it forward. Now, the Golden Dawn is about as far away from its progenitor, which is Blue Lodge Masonry, as maybe like I am from my 7th or 8th great grandparent, but nonetheless, I'm only here because of them. And it's the same thing with the Golden Dawn. And it's ultimately those traditions, the Golden Dawn in particular, that gives you, the initiation thing. And now a lot of people will mix up, they'll conflate the Golden Dawn with Aleister Crowley. What Aleister Crowley did and what, his organizations, his splinter groups of the Alpha et Omega or the OTO, it's antithetical to Golden Dawn work. It's the opposite. And he structured them to be intentional inversions of this system. I won't get into why he did that, or we could, but I want to backtrack just for a second and talk about this because I think it's important. One of the things that initiation did for me was it broke my head open like an egg over time. And it showed me how I had all the pieces in the wrong place. And the biggest thing that we do as a species, the biggest cop-out, is we say, if there's a God who is the good, how could he allow so much pain? And the thing is that you are, in that statement, assuming a position of intellectual arrogance rather than epistemological humility. Because if there is an infinite mind that controls all this, you are an ant on a hood of a car. You do not possess the rational cognitive functions to be able to understand the teleology, the purpose, the existential purpose of the thing that you are standing on. So now why would you condescend to orient the locus of what is good solely to the human experience? You have no idea what an infinite mind considers good, okay? So, and to say that my suffering can lead to no good is not just arrogant, it's foolish. It's evidence that you don't have enough life experience yet to realize that most of the good stuff that has happened into my life is because I had to suffer.
Yeah. Bro, that actually brought a tear to my eye because one, your passion is just so palpable. And maybe it's partially the microdose I took this morning. Maybe it's the fact that I was literally cleaning up blood off the floor from my cat with cancer before this podcast. But what you just said is so fucking true, man. Like, how can we conceive of what is good with our limited, feeble human minds, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so much more to reality. There's so much more beyond the horizon of the entire human experience, which, it reminds me of, have you ever heard the stories of the overview effect that the astronaut, like particularly Edgar Mitchell, who went on to like dedicate his life to the study of psi, pretty esoteric endeavors, that feeling you get when you see the earth from above and you're like, holy shit, all of the suffering, all of the innovation, all of the passion, all of everything that's ever occurred in the entire human experience and all of human history, all of these things that, you could dedicate your entire life, which you are, for instance, to trying to understand these esoteric truths. You'll never get there. No one can ever get there within a single lifetime. And that's just one tiny example of something on one tiny marble in the cosmos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having that kind of visceral realization, looking down on Earth, like that's what that rant reminded me of.
Yeah, and but the thing is, it's a lot of people are tempted to take something like that distance, and say and look at it as evidence of insignificance.
Yes,
when it's not insignificant, you just don't understand it. You don't understand, and this is why I say that to me it appears that as a species, we are in a spiritual adolescence. Why? Because we behave the way adolescents do. We behave like children. We look up and say, you're mean. Why does this happen? You're not looking at you can't even fathom the bigger picture of this stuff. Like, why don't we know this? What happened along the way where we can't, because at a certain point, humanity dealt with this. And it's becoming more increasingly as we're being abstracted not only from the human experience, which is to say engaging in activities that have defined and accompanied our human existence here since we've arrived, like, community gatherings, gardening, etc., so on and so forth. The average person is by and large removed from agriculture, growing their own food, etc., and things of this nature. Now, but we've also been abstracted from traditional community dynamics. And so we've become hyper selfish. If you look back, I challenge you, look back on the constant, relentless flood of advertisements for products over the last 20 years. There's always an emphasis, especially in the last 10. You could have it your way. It's your plan. It's you. It's all about, they're trying to make you just become closed off, self-centered.
Yeah.
Self-centered. And you know what happens when you self-center? You self-deify. Okay. And that's that you become the ultimate arbiter of what is right, what is wrong, who is right, who is wrong, what groups are right, what groups are wrong. Instead of occupying a space of epistemological humility that is based in traditional community. We're all in it together.
We should be. We should be all.
Well, whether we like it or not, we're stuck on this ride for the time being,
So yeah, point well taken. Completely agree. And you're pointing to like deep truths with the schism that I think is developing in the collective psyche, the individual psyche, to the deeper reality, to from the idea that I think I want deeper truth. I think I want to know like the mysteries of reality. And a lot of people think they do know them already, right? Like if you like read the comments, right? Everybody wants to tell you what's right, what revelations they've received. But in reality, that way of being, as you're pointing to, cuts you off from higher truth and puts you deeper into like selfish delusions and twists of truth. And that's a whole separate line of conversation. I think we've made that point. But we started having this conversation about higher realities, what these higher realities actually are, what this order actually is, what these beings that or minds that exist within these higher realities are. We started going in that direction, and I want to keep going there because as far flung as that is, and maybe as escapist as that is, that's the type of thing I think about a lot. And I rarely have the opportunity to talk to someone like you that comes from not only deep study but actual practice toward understanding what those realms are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, traditionally, there are two ways of conceiving of this intelligence that is fluid throughout the universe. Um, Particularly, I want to talk about intelligence as a spectrum of awareness, some of which has a body and some of which does not have a body, a discrete form. Okay. So it's a spectrum of consciousness. And on one end is the denser manifestation, and on the other is the more subtle, the more rarefied. The whole practice is bridging that gap. How does the form of consciousness that takes a form that is spatially specific, how do we then come to know and interact with the spectrum of consciousness which doesn't, and which ostensibly comprises at least half of our reality, it as a kind of behind the curtain thing? This gulf, the fact that we discovered the fact that these things without discrete form can and do change things. This is the origin of the term occult. People look at they hear the word occult, and the first thing they hear, the red flag, is cult.
Right.
Cult, right? Which essentially comes from the Latin cultus, which means religious worship. Now, occult does not mean the same thing. It does not even mean, it's not even close.
Yeah.
It's based in the root oculus, which is the eye.
Oh, interesting.
And applying sight. Oculus. So occultus means hidden from sight. And what that means is that these things, not only are they hidden from our sight, but their mechanisms, their chains of causality are also hidden. We can't view this sequential, rational causal chain the way we could if I threw an egg and hit the wall and it dripped to the ground. There are other things going on. Or if somebody builds a spacecraft and then sends people, we have to justify, okay, the physics has got to get right. The construction has got to be right. This has its own set of rules, but we're not able to physically quantify how that change takes place because I did a ritual, or because I petitioned a spirit or a god. So on the disembodied spectrum, we call those, spirits that we work with in magic, or intelligences. The higher end would be angelic, and above that would be archangelic, and then above that would be divine. So at the divine root, these are the personalities, or really you could think of them, if you want to anthropomorphize them, you could think of them as the personalities of the impersonal, ineffable deity, God with a capital G. Or you could think of it also like this. Think of God as, or the source, if you like, if you prefer that, the source of being. Consciousness in its fullness is like white light, okay? And, anybody that's familiar with optics or has, seen the Pink Floyd cover for The Dark Side of the Moon knows that when you, and Isaac Newton demonstrated this actually for the first time, but when a beam of white light passes through a tetrahedronal prism, and there's significance to that too, it refracts into the spectrum of color, which is organized according to color theory into 7 colors, but also 12. Okay. Same thing with music in the West. We have a scale of 7 notes that is comprised of 12 half steps, half tones. Okay. So that means that all of those colors exist in the white light, but they need to be separated in order to manifest as distinct. Think of how pleasing colors are to the eye, rather than just plain white. And so we can think of that root where the white light becomes the spectrum of color, and as the personalities, the archangelic forms of God. These are also the gods, the numbers. This is all what we're trying to get to. And when I say these things, I don't mean them literally, because you were talking about something earlier where you said they were moving towards a different kind of truth. And that is what they understood. That is what ancient peoples understood, is that there is a truth beyond the ostensible,
right,
beyond the measurable. And they we would refer to that retrospectively as symbolic truth, which is more real than anything else going on here. And so obviously this
to them, they would almost, like, just to put it in like a very modern zeitgeisty way, they it's like trying to ask the question of, like, what's outside of the simulation. What is outside of the simulacra that we exist within? Because clearly there's all of this evidence of order, of higher mind, of intentionality, basically, that's echoing throughout reality. But how do we get to that? Like, how do we, and what is it?
Yeah. And so like I was saying earlier, there are two ways of kind of dealing with that. What is it, right? You in the older traditions, you referred to these sections of that broad band of consciousness. If you wanted to interact with a discrete section of that consciousness, you would call it a spirit or an intelligence or an entity. Now,
daimon.
Yeah, exactly. That's a generic term for spirit, right? So in ancient Greek. So more modern ways of working with it that are no less effective, really, it depends on the type of person, is calling it energy. We don't, I wrote a book called Aetheric Magic, and it's all based off of this kind of energy work that I synthesized from being, educated in Chinese medicine and doing Qigong for many, many years in energy, that kind of practice, the Eastern stuff and the Western stuff. And they meet. They actually, you got to have both to me to have the full system. But you put that together and you're effectively working with energies, right? A spirit is going to be more of an interface. Something that you can talk to it, you can command it to do things. And then on the other end, we're working with what we call energy. Now, I had recourse to call it energy because there's nothing else I can call it, but I'm not convinced it is actual energy in terms of the way that we would scientifically understand it. But there's no other word really to be able to talk about it.
Subtle energy, maybe.
Right, correct. That's probably the best thing that you could say about it at this point.
So yeah, and this is just an idea that's so, again, ensconced in every single spirit, not even just esoteric tradition, but if you go back far enough, spiritual tradition, like in the Indian Eastern context, it's prana. In the Greek context, it's pneuma, and then there's ether, which I don't know if I fully understand the relationship between pneuma and ether and what makes them different. But also, even if we're going into the modern zeitgeist and the phenomena and thinking of it that way, there is this understanding that there is like something else going on. Ether is talked about, actually, as you know, particularly by people like looking at his face in my head, particularly by Rudolf Steiner. He brings us into anthroposophy and whatever, but he's appealing to older esoteric terminology with that. And then there are people directly off of him, like this guy, Trevor James Constable, who wrote this book called Cosmic Pulse of Life. And he's talking about ether and plasma and all these sort of like subtle intermediary kinds of subtle energy, really, as being related to the phenomena and these things appearing. And what's interesting about Constable, before I go away from him, is he actually does talk about it more like organisms. And he actually believed that he developed a kind of photography where you could visualize these organisms in the atmosphere and stuff like that. So there does seem to be this conversation about subtle energy, ether, plasma, pneuma, whatever you want to call it. That is very key to understanding not just the phenomena, but reality and whatever's going on with reality.
Yeah, and as you know, they already had a conception of this in early, ancient theurgy, right? Particularly by way of Iamblichus of Chalcis, the Syrian Neoplatonist and Neo-Pythagorean philosopher who basically gives us the foundations of ceremonial magic as applied to the evolution of the soul, which is nothing less than initiation. That we call theurgy, right? He has this whole, really, Iamblichus gives us an amazing stratification of this intelligence and the way it, by way of analogy, it vertically reaches down from the highest to the lowest, right? Starting with the different types of gods, right? Like hypercosmic gods, gods outside of the cosmos, cosmic gods, gods inside the cosmos. Then there's liberated gods that can go. They're like they can go in between. They can be in the cosmos. They can be outside of the cosmos. And he moves down, and he includes archangels, angels, but he gets to daimones, spirits, the generic term, and these daimones are essentially intermediaries between us and the higher powers. And the thing that he says is that the daimones have a body, but it's etheric.
Mm.
They have a pneumatic, a spiritual body. They're composed really of ether because, in the Aristotelian sense, ether was a fifth substance that allowed sunlight to come through, and it moved with and on the air, very similar to Tesla's the luminiferous ether as
Yeah.
a medium, meaning like there's
Yeah.
no vacuum anywhere. It's just this thing that we can't see, that things are coming out of and receding back into. That's the way they would have
Yeah.
looked at it, and so the idea that these spirits have these etheric bodies has been around for a long time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and this idea of the I always say this word wrong. The lumen God damn it.
The luminiferous.
Luminiferous. It sounds like somebody who doesn't know how to speak, but it's that was luminiferous or something.
Yeah.
Like Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
The luminiferous ether. Did I say that right?
Yes.
This is the thing that the Michelson-Morley experiments supposedly disproved, right? It was a long-held belief that this ether must exist, that this medium across that energy or light would travel across must exist. It's not just this ancient idea. It was this. It really followed through, at least to a large portion of physicists, cosmologists, scientists, and then supposedly this Michelson-Morley experiment was done to prove that there was no ether, and that's a whole interesting sidebar in and of itself. But there are people who still think the ether exists, and I would assume that you are one of those people.
Well, here's the thing, I and this is what I encourage people to do if they're interested in sort of retrieving the ability to understand the world on those esoteric terms. I have what modern science tells me, and I have my experience, which is also informed much more by, it's more supported
Hmm.
by the ancient worldview. And I hold these two things side by side, and I leave them to have their own domains of authority in my life, but I allow them to communicate with each other. Now, people call this cognitive dissonance. It's only cognitive dissonance because somebody put it in your head that it's got to be either or.
Right.
That's part of your perceptual software. It's part of your programming, is this idea of cognitive dissonance, when in reality, I live a much fuller life by being able to hold these two things and not have to have
Right.
one explain the other away or
Totally.
stamp the other out. You have them together, right? Because you don't die with the objective facts, you die with your subjective experience. So you have to incorporate both of these in order to begin to have the ancient worldview or the esoteric worldview that allows these things to work in a much more real and vivid and experiential framework. Now, so on the one hand, to me, my experience and the ancient evidence is much more supportive of the luminiferous ether. Um, I think we misunderstood it when we were trying to fit it into the scientific box. But there is also obviously the fact there's the possibility that the reality of the situation could be that there is no luminiferous ether. And I don't need one to solve the other, but when I'm, sort of planning things, doing ceremonial, doing energy work, doing soul flight sort of stuff, for lack of a better term, I'm not working out. I'm not rooting myself in
Yeah,
the
you're not worried
scientific
about
mind.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm rooting, like, that's people say about like, yeah, well, we abandoned those models because they thought the earth was the center of the universe. It's like,
Right.
technically consciousness is the center of the universe, and I'm experiencing this consciousness. Now, that's not to say that we should, become self-centered, but it's, as a practitioner, it's useless to work with, the sun is the center of gravity. Yes, absolutely. Obviously, but you know, you want to work your from your perspective, your interface out, right? That's the source of this stuff, ceremonial and stuff like that. It's everything you do is from here outward. So it's basically like, again, giving these things their own domains of authority, their own. Okay, this works for this. This is the right tool for this job, and this is the right tool for this job.
Right. Yeah, so we went from Iamblichian, hypercosmic, transcendent gods that are
Mhm.
outside the cosmos to this notion that there is this whole chain of beings that proceed from all the way to this transcendent part of reality that we can't even begin to grok, down to these subtle bodied, what they would have considered to be spiritual beings called daimons. And
Mhm.
I'm just gonna like push the chips forward and say my personal suspicion is that
Mhm.
what we're seeing when we see the phenomena, or we're seeing, high strangeness, whatever, is probably what the ancients would have called daimons, or people within the Hellenic context would have called that. And by that, what I mean is beings that probably mostly exist with subtle bodies that are sort of like trans medium material, and maybe those bodies only appear at certain times, right? Like if have you ever read any John Keel by chance?
No,
Okay, he's probably most well-known book in terms of like pop culture references would be Mothman Prophecies, but
I've heard of the book.
Operation Trojan Horse is one that I would definitely recommend. Um but anyway, this was essentially what he was positing, and he called these beings ultra terrestrials. And by ultra terrestrials, what he meant is that there are these beings. See if this sounds familiar to you. That exist in an extended part of reality. He called it extended electrodynamics, basically, and that under certain conditions, which in the UFO sort of context we would call, UFO flaps, or we would call window areas into paranormal phenomena. Sometimes these things can manifest, and oftentimes they manifest in sort of like waves, where like there's like these waves of phenomena where a
Mhm.
span of time will pass. All these people will see stuff. They'll see UFOs. They'll see weird beings. They'll see weird lights manifesting, and for whatever reason, in those parts of reality become more permeable, where these
Mhm.
subtle things can become more embodied or something for a period of time. So
Mhm.
pushing my chips forward, that sort of nutshells what I think could be going on here, and how I think that folds into this conversation, and whether we're using what I think is more sophisticated ancient language, like what Iamblichus and the Neoplatonists were presenting, or we're talking about like what John Keel was presenting. I think we're playing word games here with
Mhm.
what pointing to what I think that what's behind the mask of the phenomena really is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that the distinction to be made again is in worldview, right? Because modern verbiage, the modern way of understanding these things, or in the postmodern age, is we have something that they didn't have,
Yeah.
uh, and it's not what people think I'm gonna say. Um, it is we have mass media and science fiction. So science fiction, obviously, really the birth of science fiction came about uh, proper, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. It gave us an aesthetic. It
Right.
gave us images, verbiage, just enough to suspend any disbelief. And this excitement about space travel, and people like Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, who I love. They gave us these ideas, and they were sort of rooting them in science, in what they understood about science at that time. Uh, and so this plays in perfectly. It situates itself very neatly into the, or at least more neatly than the antique worldview. It situates itself very neatly into our scientific reductionism, because what we're saying is, we can explain this by waves and energies and things of this nature. We're not necessarily wrong, and but we're constantly reducing things down to a physicality, right? It can't be spontaneous, inexplicable spiritual experience. It's entheogens. It
Right.
can't be, a spiritual entity that, yes, can impress itself into this side of the veil and take a form. It's got to be, discrete aliens like
Yeah.
grays that live in some Pleiadian system. I'm not disparaging these ideas, but what I'm saying is there's a miscommunication. There's a
Yeah.
gulf in understanding, because we've taken these things. It's like
Yes.
we have to find a physical way to explain it. They didn't need to do that. And that, when you get into that
Right.
territory, when you get into the unnecessity of needing to reduce everything to some sort of scientific proposition, in my experience, that's when stuff begins to happen.
Yeah,
That's
man.
when you
Yeah.
begin to, have those big experiences and interact with these things. It wasn't until that veneer finally dropped that I began to have the experiences that made me, you know, as Carl Jung says, I don't need to believe, I know now.
Yeah, right, right. Well, I want to hear more about what you mean by that. And I know that there's a certain of like I don't know, man. I think you probably share this sensibility I have, that there are certain things that I will always keep private, but I'll talk about them in the sort of like, generalities.
Mhm.
Um and I would imagine that when you embark on the path that you embark on, part of that is like there are certain things you say philosophically and esoterically silent about, not because you don't want to like tell people the truth, but because one, it's so sacred and personal, and two, because we should sidebar into why things do need to be esoteric and initiatory, you know, for not nefarious reasons at some point in the conversation. Um, that's a whole separate thing. But before I lose this thread, I was having this thought yesterday about magical thinking, how a lot of kids, especially, and even adults, still have this idea that like if I do this weird thing consistent with what I want, it will make that thing happen, right? Like
Mhm.
the most like cliche version of it is just saying manifestation or, the secret or whatever. But I remember being a little kid before I had any idea of those things and being like, if I do this thing, if I make this shot, then this will happen, this other thing that I want to happen. And it's just like stupid childish stuff, right?
Mhm.
And you have to ask yourself, like, where does that come from? Like maybe that's just wishful thinking, part of like how the human psyche works, or maybe it's indicative of something that is true on a deeper level. And here's an example of how it could be true consistent with the worldview that we've been talking about. If there are beings that exist primarily in a non-physical form, or intelligences that exist primarily in a non-physical form, what would their causation be in terms of like coming down into this realm and interacting in this realm? It would be thought, right? They would have some
Mhm.
ability to take their thought or intention or consciousness and concentrate it in such a way that it creates something physically real. Now, we do not have this ability, despite what someone in the comments is about to say. Like they're going to say, I could do this. And I think if we do have this ability, it's so subtle, which is to the point, which illustrates why psi itself is so hard. Like I have a good friend, Adam Curry, who's been doing psi research like his entire life, and he's certain that it exists, yet pinning it down, very difficult. It's very streaky. Often seems to be, there's this weird phenomena of beginner's luck where people do really, really well in the beginning at, like, let's say, manipulating the outcome of a random number generator or influencing it, and then it falls off. Or they try to learn remote viewing and they get a few hits early on and then it falls off.
Yeah.
Now, let's just imagine that we're sort of viewing reality inside out and that we think that we have that ability. But really, what has that ability is something that's so endemic to what we are, but has nothing to do with who I am as Michael or who you are as Ike.
Correct.
It has something to do with a part of reality that we came from that is like so transcendent, but is not physical. And at the same time, and what's weird is I believe we're still in that right now, but we're also like so dissociated from it that we don't even perceive it.
Mm.
And then to sort of like finish that thought, my suspicion is that when you die, there will be an almost like, oh yeah, that occurs. Like, oh yeah, like I've been here the whole time. I've been doing this the whole time. I thought I was doing that, or I was so enamored with doing that, but really I've been here this whole time. And now imagine that idea that your thought that consciousness has some kind of ability to interact with reality or cause reality to do something. Maybe that's even truer than we can possibly imagine, but we get this idea totally inside out and that we think we do it from this physical, again, like we think of consciousness as an epiphenomena of the brain. We think of psi as an epiphenomena of the epiphenomena, right? Like, which is totally probably inside out from, I think, if it is real, how it probably actually is, which is totally disembodied, not incarnate, has no need to be incarnate except when it feels like it or has some necessity to be incarnate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points there. And so William Wynne Westcott, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, he wrote an inner order memorandum or like a note that this became a tradition that they called the flying rolls. Okay, and this would have been probably 1901, around then, 1902. Maybe earlier, but he talks about will and desire and he uses the example that when you pass somebody in the street, you get this funny feeling that like, I know that guy or that girl, or I don't know why, but I feel like I should look back, and you turn and you may find occasionally that person is also heading in the opposite direction, but turned to look at you. Now, say you wanted to repeat the experiment. Now you would have desire for outcome.
Right.
You'd have less of an ability to suspend your desire so that it could happen truly, spontaneously, because that's how it has to happen. So the way we say this, the way we express this is that you cannot will two things at once. You cannot will two things at once. Okay, this is very, very early on in your Golden Dawn training when you get to the inner order. Now, why is this the case? Well, we have a really, really good, mythos in Plato, which he gives us in the myth of right, which is his ancient NDE sort of out-of-body experience. Dies, leaves not only his body, but the cosmos. And before they send these reincarnating souls back after this whole ordeal of tying them into the karmic wheel of the cosmos with their daimon, after that's done, they walk to a river and they scoop. They are made. It says the verbiage is they are made to drink from that river, and that river is called Lethe.
Yeah.
And Lethe in Greek means forgetfulness.
Yeah.
So then we end up using this. We end up using this as the central motif or the central, let's say, paradigm, archetype to understand that the soul, which is by its nature, according to this tradition, immortal, has no needs, can go anywhere, non-spatially specific,
spherical,
right? Spherical, now tied to something that has needs, is mortal, is spatially specific.
Right.
And the fact that it is now bound to its antithesis confuses it.
Yes. Yes.
And so we call this lethe, forgetfulness, and we talk about what the Platonic tradition is supposed to do, right? Paideia, which means the education of the soul. And we know from the Meno, Socrates proves, and he talks about it throughout the tradition, there is no learning anything, there is only remembering. And we call this memory anamnesis. Like amnesia, anamnesis means not forgetting. Okay, so the whole thing is that the illusion we're constantly enthralled to is precisely the thing that is preventing us from being able to do magic without a ritual. And you need to not have this. So many people come around, they're like, everything's non-dual, man. It's like, yeah, good luck. Okay. Right. On one sense, sure, you know that intellectually. You know that theoretically. You know that because you've heard other people say it and it makes sense to you. But you need to have an experience of that, a realization of that. You need to go lucid in the dream of life. Okay. And that is a totally different experience than being able to, like, yeah, it's cool. I get it. You know, this is a very different experience. This is what they were trying to do in the Platonic tradition and in its extensions, which is Neoplatonism and Hermetism. Okay, which is the study of Hermetic literature before the Middle Ages is called Hermetism, and afterwards it's Hermeticism. So they used techniques of interacting with spiritual intermediaries in various ways in order to get them to that place of remembering, of understanding there, because there are spirits, there are daimones who are here to help. They're here to assist us, particularly what we would call the familiar or the personal daimon. Now, did they think all daimones or daimons were created equal? No. There's a big tradition within Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Hermetism. They talk about many different kinds of daimons, right? There are elemental daimons.
Yeah.
Okay, that do the stuff of the earth, you know, water, air, earth, fire. There are kakodaimons, right? Impure spirits that are they attempt to drag you down and further into materiality and away from divine remembrance, which again is an experience.
I've had that not experience. It sucks.
There you go. And then there are agathodaimons, which are guides of good counsel, beneficial daimons that are trying to help. And even more insidiously, there is the antimimon daimon, which is the counterfeit daimon. It is a daimon that gains your trust and makes you think it has your best interest in mind, but in reality is dragging you towards, you know, and a malicious end. So there's a very, very rich and full tradition behind interaction with these spirits. And Iamblichus goes so far as to talk about how they manifest, right? And we call it theurgic appearance. He talks about how daimons manifest. He talks about, he describes how angels, archangels, deities will manifest. And all of it is centered around this one idea: various gradations of light. So, yeah.
Dude, this is a perfect hinge point again. Like, so I've been, for all of the reasons that we're starting to hint at here, I hope it's making sense to the audience. Like, I don't need to connect the dots in my own mind. Like, all of this makes perfect sense to me, but just to try to like walk through some of these steps for people who are a little bit lost here or like overwhelmed by terminology, ideas, whatever. There's been a big trend, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years around this idea of what you would either call CE5 or psionic contact with the phenomena, basically. The more recent one is the psionic contact. This kind of came off the back of, there's this whistleblower that came forward. His name is Jake Barber, former Special Forces military guy, made this claim that within classified programs, there were teams of psionic people who would basically put out these psychic calls to make things manifest. And then the really crazy part is that they would then down these things and like take them. So that's the claim, right? So then off the back of that, there are people who are like, for curiosity reasons, benevolent reasons, probably also nefarious reasons, who go out and they try to psychically make something appear, whether it's a craft or it seems to almost every time actually be a light, like an orb or orbs that are moving in all kinds of crazy ways, where it's like, okay, that can't be a satellite, that can't be a plane. And like, let's just lend credence, or for now, let's suspend disbelief. And I know the audience will have no problem doing this, but everybody, you and me, everyone, let's suspend disbelief and say that is a thing that is actually happening. Mm-hmm. Luminous appearances do sometimes manifest in accordance with what you desire or what you're putting forth out there. And I've personally met some of these people who are called psionics, and a lot of them project like loving, like huge open-hearted loving kindness, or they think of it as like anahata chakra energy that they're like blasting out, and that makes these things occur. And then what's interesting, and I'm sure you'll have thoughts on this, is sometimes there's like a quality that seems to inhabit the person's mind, like a divine feminine, or or sometimes it's like innocuous, where it's like, yeah, we're here, we're just hanging out, like, sure, we'll show you this. But sometimes it's accompanied by this like huge, almost divine sort of archetypal intelligence. From your POV, from the milieu that you're ensconced in, what terminology would you use to try to describe what I just told you about from this like phenomena UFO sort of POV?
Yeah. Well, just to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly, so they're saying that the appearance will involve like lights, orbs. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes.
So
yes, and sometimes people say craft, but I think that that's less common. I mean, one thing you do kind of hear a lot is like, yeah, I won't even go there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there are multiple ways to encounter these entities among the techniques which are extant and which we have. So one of them is, you said something interesting earlier, and I'm going to tie back into this. This ether, let's say this etheric energy that the daimones, the spirits, are supposed to be able to use as a body. So that's also what ectoplasm was, right? Charles Richet talking about that as a way to describe these apparitions that were taking this fluidic light, the ether, from the medium and projecting it somewhere in the room. That's where the term ectoplasm comes from. It's related to this luminosity in that age of spiritism and seance.
Yeah.
But it is visible. That light is visible. People can see it. I see it. I wrote a book to teach anyone who wants to how to see it. Okay. In etheric magic, you call it the aura, the inner aura, the outer aura. When you are able to train your sight, because everyone can do it, unless unfortunately you don't have sight, you are training. It's not the spiritual thing where you're praying and projecting and imagining. All you're doing is you're trying to use your vision differently than you normally do, right? We talked a little bit about the little boxes that we make in order to organize our phenomenal reality. We're used to using our vision. We're like, okay, here's a mug. I see it as a discrete object, and my eyes are focusing on it to look at it. Okay, that's when you are able to cultivate a different kind of sight, a relaxed gaze, in which you're taking in a panorama and periphery simultaneously. This is when you begin to be able to see the luminosity. And those are just the first steps. Okay. Those are just the first steps. You will eventually be able to, with practice, not have to sort of toggle and adjust your vision. It will just be you tune in or you tune out. So in this way, ceremonialists are taught to develop this sight so that they can perceive what is going on in the room, any changes before or after you're asking something to come in, you're calling something, you're setting in a radiant intention. Dr. Stephen Skinner, who is an academic and a very well-known practitioner, he says that he knows when the entity has appeared because within his his space of practice, there is what he refers to as a champagne sparkle in the air. Okay, a luminosity, and I know exactly what he's talking about. So that's one method. The other method is by using what I hesitate to say imagination, because there are connotations to imagination, connotations of falsity, of fantasy. I will use I think the more accurate term that Henry Corbin, the scholar, right, the imaginal. And this is a power of the soul. A lot of us only ever use our imagination intentionally to daydream or think things up or dream things up, etc., so on and so forth. So in that aspect, we have this modern idea that the imaginal is something that you create stuff with, right? Okay, that is true. But what we don't realize is that the imaginal can also be something that you receive things with. It is nothing less than an instrument of spiritual perception when you have trained it to be such. So in our traditions, what we would have is we have this intelligence. I'm calling, let's say, the spirit of Mars, Bartzabel. I'm going to call him down. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask him to appear in my scrying device. Now, that can either be, the sort of cliche crystal ball. Many magicians and ceremonialists use a polished obsidian mirror because it's black, reflects really no image of yourself. But the traditional way, in, say, like the Greek magical papyri, you know, for those who don't know, I'm just talking about ancient Greco-Egyptian magic from the 100 B or 200 BC to 500 AD or CE, right? In there, they use bowls, and they put pure water in those bowls, and they would drip oil onto the surface of the water. Now, what's happening is Bartzabel in my mirror? No, he's not. But what's happening is I'm using this device, this reflective device, as a focal point to be able to shut down, to sort of go into like sleep mode, safety mode, and begin to use my imaginal to perceive what will appear there. And it's a state of anticipation. It's a state of cultivating what I call immanence in the moment, a hyper focus, but a relaxed focus, and then allowing the image to appear in the eye of your mind, your soul, the eye of your soul, really. And these are what the ceremonialist and scholar David Rankine has called gateway images. They are only agreed upon forms with which that dense side of the spectrum can communicate with the bodiless, the disembodied side. We use the imaginal. Why? Because human beings, souls incarnated, we need images, we need words, we need ways to understand this stuff. And so what is happening a lot of the time is that this intelligence being impelled and called by the ceremonialists is often using your available imagery to interface with you. Now, there's a sophisticated technique of intentionally building an imaginal vehicle that is going to sort of like be comfortable, right? It's like, am I going to stay very long in a jacket that's too tight? No, I'm going to, it's more comfortable. I'm going to be more attracted to utilizing this. And this technique is called the construction of telesmatic images in something like the Golden Dawn. I'm getting a little technical there, but just to show the way that the imaginal will happen. And of course, there's dream work, right? That's a huge part of ceremonial, ancient and modern, is dream work, visitations, healings, divinations by dream.
Yeah, so it's like you're creating some sort of a pictorial vessel or an idea vessel for something, for something numinous to inhabit, so that you can interact with it. So
precisely.
But the original question, though I love the rabbit hole, what was if someone is going out and conceiving of summoning, inviting. Some people get really mad when I use the word summoning. It's funny. Like, I don't know. I'll leave that there.
Yeah.
Whatever you want, whatever your preferred
Yeah.
gentle verb is for compelling something to manifest. How would you describe that from your milieu? I guess also the secondary question of what would you conceive of if you succeeded in doing that? What would you conceive of that thing being?
Right. So I'm assuming. So the way that I answered it before was sort of phenomenologically. But are you asking about like what would I do in terms of technique? What would I call it, or what would I call the entity itself?
I guess both. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would, if something were to appear before me, that's real easy. It's just evocation. If it's actually happening, we call this, or put it this way: if your visible sight can see it, like your normal sight can see it, this is called the visible evocation to visible appearance of an entity. This is also sometimes assisted by incense smoke or fluid condensers. Sometimes it's just there. Now, that entity, a big part of the ceremonial tradition is sussing out, like, what are you? So you normally will ask it questions and test it. There are different ways depending on which branch of the tradition you're in. But the nomenclature we have for, things like that, maybe orbs, it varies. I would say, here's the thing about magic and ceremonial: it differs from mediumism. It differs tremendously. And the founders of the Golden Dawn really wanted to stress this because they were in a time where trance mediumship was becoming increasingly popular, seances, because of, theosophy and all that stuff. So they went to great pains to say, look, we're not just opening up and whatever comes, comes. That's not magic. That's mediumism. What we're doing is we are creating a space into which may only enter that which we are calling. Okay. And so if I called a spirit, the spirit of Mars, Bartzabel, and it appeared to me in a light, in a scrying mirror, in my mind's eye, I would call it a spirit. Because it's just taxonomy. It's just a way for me to understand it. Then you test it to see if it kind of evidences characteristics of a spirit, which they're lower on the totem pole than let's say they're higher up, their manager, that we call that spectrum of consciousness the intelligence. Okay, so the spirit is it has less autonomy. It has less. It doesn't know. It can't. Yes, yeah, and it can't answer questions the way an intelligence can. So yeah, there are some of those ways, but then if you go back to the ancient school, they have different names. They call them daimones and things like this. But ultimately, it is a manifestation in some form or another. I would, maybe in modern parlance, I would call it an etheric manifestation of a metaphysical intelligence.
Yeah. That makes sense. That does make sense to me. And so one of the other things, like, we had all these things that we were going to potentially riff on today, potential anecdotes, potential sort of stories from history, and people from history who are sort of walking this line between what we would perceive to be, this phenomena that is bracketed in UFO terms and the esoteric. And obviously, people like Jack Parsons are on that list. People like Crowley are sort of on that list, though less so. Though there are interesting instances of him interacting with things that he depicts in very alien-like ways, like this lamb encounter. But we're getting deep into the amount of time I think that we have today. So maybe, also, stories like people like John Dee, who's like,
yeah.
But these are all kind of different but related, respective rabbit holes. What are some of your favorites, or what, not even just restricted to that list of options? Like, what figures or anecdotes do you think were shining interesting light on this sort of Venn diagram or overlap?
Sure. I think so. For me, I was just so intensely interested from the very start. Even if I had to suspend my disbelief in the process, I was so intensely interested in the history of the Golden Dawn. It is so fascinating. The truth is stranger than fiction. Um, there are a lot of records of certain things happening, uh, magical things, psychic things that these people from the turn of the century that were quite well known are writing down. For instance, the actress Florence Farr, who was the muse of George Bernard Shaw. She talks about how she had uh, spirit communications with uh, ancient intelligences that spoke to her through figures in the Egyptian museum, the Egyptian section of the British Museum.
Wow.
You get William Butler Yeats,
Yeah.
right, the novelist and great poet. He's a part of the Golden Dawn as well, and he's talking about how he was induced to spontaneous vision by the placing on, the laying on of hands by his superior,
Mm.
Sam Mathers in the Golden Dawn.
Wow.
And it's just
It's like a Shakti put.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's this autonomous vision that you don't really have control over. You just, I'm not thinking this. So there are those things, but then there are really interesting people like Eliphas Levi, and Allan Kardec, right, who invented or coined the term for spiritism this time. Blavatsky is a fascinating figure to me. A lot of people. Here's a part of history that I think is super, super important that people just brush through or gloss over. Um, Franz Anton Mesmer. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So this Franz Anton Mesmer, for anybody that doesn't know, he was a physician. Okay. And I believe it was the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, where he, I believe he started out in Vienna and then had to move to Paris, or it might have been the other way around. But either way, what he did is he is credited with what he calls the discovery of animal magnetism. So he found in trying to heal these people that he could put them into these like sleep states. And that's where we get the term mesmerized from, right? Now we call that art hypnotism, but it used to be called mesmerism. And a lot of show hypnotism that you see nowadays is not, it's not, that's not the authentic way to practice it, because it's basically disavowing the fact that I have to work on your energy body. It's just, let's see what I can do to your psychology. That's not what Mesmer was doing. Mesmer was putting them out using these polarized rods and the waving of his hand and through their energy body. And he called this animal magnetism. He calls this it's almost, it could be conceived like I guess in one sense orgone or something like that.
Yeah.
But he's the guy who discovers this early on, and the rest of all the theorizing that Levi does, that Blavatsky does, that Golden Dawn magic is based off of, it's very root in the Western tradition. That specific sort of thing is from Mesmer, and because he puts these people into these states and they begin prophesying. To his shock, they begin speaking in languages that they have, this is like a working class person, and all of a sudden they're just randomly speaking classical Greek and things like this. But he could also more dangerously, he could make them do things, that's a hairy spot to be.
Yeah.
So somebody like Eliphas Levi would borrow heavily from Mesmer in his discussion of the way ceremonial works and the way magic works. He talked about it as, right, because as part of the French tradition of occultism, particularly around that period, the mid 19th century, the French occult revival, there's a lot of foreplay. They conceal just as much as they reveal, and you've really got to figure out the meaning behind the obscurity. So Levi calls it the azot, the magical agent, by which, to grasp the fulcrum of this is to be able to make all things happen, to act as the magus, and so on and so forth. and he's very vague about what the azot is. Okay, but there is a very little treatise called The Science of Hermes, and I found it in a bookstore in Brooklyn probably like 15 years ago. And this is the one time that I have found Levi to be explicit.
Wow.
And he says, azot, the magical agent, is nothing less than magnetized electricity. So again, we're talking about that electromagnetic sort of thing that spectrum that you were talking about before. We're also trying to fit it into a scientific model, which I think it only half fits, but it's related.
Yeah.
He's really basing these ideas off of the work of Mesmer, and Mesmer doesn't really get talked about at all when you discuss either general history or the history of the cult, and he really deserves much more of a good look.
Yeah, because it seems like that sort of, I was going to say collapses the wave function, but that's not the right terminology. It sort of bridges the gap. If you apply your conscious mind to try to bridging that gap to get into that state, it can't be done. Yet it's that same thing that I was sort of pointing at earlier, where there's this mode of us that I think is already there or already capable of that. And it's almost like switching the channel on what you're attuned to. And you have to either use some like meditative or esoteric technique to do that, which oftentimes makes the conscious mind go offline so that you're not metacognating and you're not aware of yourself. Or you have to have an somebody who externally has a technique to get you into that state where you can be in that oracular, revelatory, magical, connected state. And then the further idea that could be connected somehow to some unseen medium that is interconnecting all things, like some etheric medium, like that really connects all the dots figuratively and literally, right? Because in a cosmic web kind of way, it also connects the dots to you and what appears to be a vast distance away from you, right? Like in that sort of a web, the idea of a planetary intelligence being however many million miles away is essentially like instantly nullified, right? Because it's not subject to those space-time laws, theoretically.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is the thing that I like to emphasize when I talk about this stuff, but it's hard to communicate. So if we think about the luminiferous ether as Tesla posited it, and as we would look at it in ceremonial magic, it is the doorway. It is the liminal point, the access point of the physical and metaphysical, and it allows two-way traffic. The only thing is you can't pass this veil with a body. So you use your mind and you extend and project consciousness, because it is not subject to space and time. It is a field that we're constantly connected to, but it's just like you're saying, we're either toggling outward or inward, and you've got to really develop that ability to toggle and then have access to that doorway. And when spirits come through, it's almost like if I were standing above a lake and everything underneath the lake is the material world. And we'll say this, just the surface tension, just the surface tension is sort of like that etheric medium. It would be like me just putting my face, dunking my head into the water. It has to go through this. And it's not a great analogy, but it serves the mental picture to show how these intelligences are. So they enter like that, and we enter with our consciousness. And so you can command a spirit. What are you using there? You're using your consciousness, your will, your knowledge, your the vibration of the divine names that you're intoning, et cetera, so on and so forth. Or you can, use your consciousness in another way, which is to sync. This is a big project. This is a part of internal alchemy. It's one of the quote unquote secrets. You have this latent etheric body. It's your microcosm, your little universe. Your organism has its own store of this potentiality. But until your conscious mind links to it, it's latent. And when you begin to link to it, it becomes like a limb that has atrophied. You've got to learn how to move it. Now in qigong circles, the way they communicate that is where the mind goes, the qi flows. Okay, so there is a way also of using the mind to access these energies, to access these intelligences, and again, obviously, the last bit is that what I talked about before, using the imaginal as the interface. That is 9 times out of 10. That's the most successful one for people.
Man, we're pulling on so many fabulously interesting threads here, and I want to like use the rest of the time we have wisely. But I'm like, which direction do I want to go? Because we could go, because from here we could go into personal practice, we could go into more anecdotes, we could go into, more theory stuff. What feels the most pregnant for you at the moment?
I have a suspicion that some people are probably going to want to know like what my personal practice looks like. Just what aspects of that we want to focus on. I put the ball in your court for that.
Well, let's go there then. So if people are, I think there would be a dual pronged interest. Maybe 3. I think that one prong will be, holy shit, do more podcasts with this guy. He seems like such a wealth of information. Prong 2 would be, what do I need to read? Who should I be looking to for more information? And then 3 probably would be like the personal practices to start doing now.
Okay. Well, first, I'd love to keep coming on, and I'd love to keep having you on my show as well, because a lot of people really loved that. I got a couple of messages saying like that conversation you had with him wasn't long enough. So, like it was great and I wanted more. But the second part, what resources can I look to? It's going to depend on your, like where you're starting from. If you are someone that has just discovered this world recently and you want a reliable sort of guide through it, I spent a very long time putting together a guide for the newly initiated, the new seeker, in terms of, oh, look, there's more than good vibes and crystals. There's nothing wrong with those things, but there's more. There's a deeper layer, and people will find that in esotericism and occultism and things like this. Okay, so let's say you've stumbled to that doorway. I created a guide in my first book, A Formless Fire, and the subtitle is Rediscovering the Magical Traditions of the West. And the main goal for me was to orient people with the context. Context is for the most part everything. We think that with the bare minimum of what you have as a person that has been just educated just enough to be able to grasp this stuff, that's sufficient to fully understand it. It's not. We've gone over this in this talk. So what I've tried to do is accumulate that context, historical, theoretical, behind everything. Ceremonial, divination, astrology, alchemy, the history of these orders. You want to know more about Freemasonry, how it connects to ceremonial and Golden Dawn and Wicca and all of this stuff, and Jack Parsons, etc. That's all in there too. So, a little bit of shameless self-promotion. But the thing is, I wrote the book that didn't exist because I was like, why haven't we done this yet? Yeah. So I think that's a really good starting place. I really like the research of Tobias Churton for people who are interested in esotericism with a historical grounding. If you're interested in the history and putting this of Tobias Churton's works are just top notch. Yeah, I mean, who else would I choose? The thing is, I've been reading stuff that's like so intense for so long.
Yeah, you can't be like read Proclus, but really you're not going to do that. So who do you? Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, if you could read Radek Chlup's introduction to Proclus, but you'd need to know something about.
You need orientation. Yeah.
I would say.
That's why I really like that Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, because it is a guy who's a classicist, who's clearly very interested personally. It doesn't feel like dead academia. It feels like he has this real passion behind it, and he walks you through from the beginning sequentially through all the major thinkers. Like I
Yeah.
always recommend that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I believe the book is called Western Esotericism by Nicholas Goodrick Clark. That's another good one. Looking for a more of an academic survey. Um, but the thing is, like, honestly, you have to read really widely, and so I've tried to do that with a Formless Fire and make it really concise.
Yeah.
Ronnie Pontiac too. Some
Mm-hmm.
of his books, his book that just came out, The Rosicrucian Counterculture. That's a really good one too. I had the privilege of getting an advanced copy of that. I think it recently dropped. That's really good. Uh, yeah, I would say though, I made a Formless Fire to legitimately answer that question for people. So,
Practices.
um, practices. I kind of told you off camera, and I don't really say it very often because a lot of the people that are interested in the things I say are more invested in the Western ceremonial or whatever tradition. But I was first trained in Zazen meditation and things of that nature, the Eastern stuff. So my practice is the morning practice would be meditation and energy work, qigong. Okay. I if somebody were to ever, I kind of very made the dramatic point of saying if anybody were to ever put a gun to my head, God forbid, and say you need to choose between your contemplative or your ritual practice, well, I'd have to choose the meditation because it's the meditation that empowers the ceremonial and also continually orients me to be able to move deeper and deeper into the phenomenology of what my consciousness is doing, right? And meditation, um, mindfulness meditation is a really good start, and I think that people should practice some form of energy work, whether that's an entry level Tai Chi or entry level Qigong. There again, I give this too in my book, Etheric Magic, all of these preliminary energy work practices. And then in terms of the actual ceremonial, let's say you want to get into it. There are considerations, right? Magic ceremonial has historically been a very convoluted and complex sort of thing that
Yeah.
involves astrological timing, et cetera, so on and so forth. But barring that, if you just want to start interacting with that, I would say to cultivate some form of a devotional practice um, that brings in the elements, what is most immediately available to us here, and to make it tangible. So you might, if you want to commune with, this spectrum of intelligence that is associated with the elemental, that daimonic nature that is elemental, the natural spirits. What I did, for instance, was I would go, I would ground, I'd take my shoes off, I'd go outside, um, cultivate using that breath work and those focus techniques I have honed with meditation, and I would leave a simple offering. I leave a little bowl of milk, a little bowl of honey, sometimes a piece of bread, sometimes a little bowl of wine, and I begin to um, you can do either or both, but you can sort of petition, speak to nature, just speak to nature and ask it to, either for something or to speak to you or to give you a really good yield in your garden this year, things like that. Or you could just listen
Mm.
and see what you if you are able to perceive anything or receive any impressions. These could have consequences later when you dream that night, or it could have the form of a spontaneous sort of insight or inspiration. These are like initial ways to like just get started without all of the trappings. Um, then there's like a more focused devotional practice where like you would pick a particular um a broader band of this of the overall spectrum of consciousness by selecting a tutelary deity. Let's say if you're more interested in pagan stuff, and then what you do is you find an image that you find to be very beautiful, and you would recite a hymn to it. There are the Orphic hymns, there are the Homeric hymns. Proclus wrote a handful of hymns that are
did he
pretty
really?
great. Yeah. Just a few. We only have a few, but they're great. And so you can recite these hymns. I would try and vibrate them and tone them, or otherwise, sing them in some way. You could whisper them if you need. You could say them in a soft voice. And the key there with devotion is not this groveling worship, or this like chore. Yeah, gotta go and leave flower petals out on the. It's try and cultivate that love, right? Like you're talking about that the emanation of that ThIs center. Cultivate love, and we call this eros, which is devotional fire. And that practice is going to do many things, but the most important for right now, right? The soul, and I'll end on this. The soul is considered erotic, not in like the
carnal.
sense. Carnal eroticism or the fantasy stuff. It has to do with the Greek word eros, which is a desirous love. We say in the philosophical traditions, which underpin this worldview, that the soul, being abstracted from its source, desires only reunion. Okay. And that manifests. How does it manifest? It manifests in that anything I want here, I'm trying to unify with. I want a sandwich. I'm going to take it into my body and assimilate it. I want to have a possession or a ring, right? This is as close as it can get to me. I want to have a spouse. I want to fall in love. Well, what's the penultimate event of expressing that love? Unity. So we're constantly desiring things, and the uninitiated and the mundane view is that our eros is constantly shining through. It's almost like so habituated so innate that we can't stop desiring things. And so I want a new job. I want a better car. I want this. I want that. What a devotional practice will help you to do is begin to turn your eros in a different direction. Just for the first time, maybe to create that little span of 20 minutes today.
Yeah.
You oriented that eros towards something that is higher, that is divine. And you used an image in order to be able to, cognizantly aim in that direction. So I'd say those are really good beginning practices for sure. And if anybody's interested in other stuff, you visit my website, ikebaker.com, and write to me.
Beautiful, man. That's one of the most beautiful things we could end on. Developing an ache, a divine, erotic ache.
Yep, absolutely. That's the name of the game, truly.
All right, man. Thanks for doing this. This has been fantastic. It absolutely flew by. And hang on for me when I hang up here.
Sure. Thanks for having me on.